right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. And for anybody who's tuning in from DC, good evening. Time change is a wonderful thing. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Mehta. I'm with Defense News. Thrilled to be here hosting a power-packed panel on a topic which I think is safe to say has gotten a lot of attention over the last 18 months or so from quite a few people. Programming note, just to make sure everyone's aware of this, audience members here and at home can ask questions for the panelists, which will be taken towards the end, using the RNDF app, which I assume everyone's downloaded. If you haven't downloaded it, you can go on Twitter, use the hashtag RNDF, send your question in. People will be monitoring those. And we'll have time towards the end to take a couple of those live. People to my right really don't need an introduction, but to be polite, we're going to give them one anyway. On the far right, we have Tori Bruno, President and CEO of the United Launch Alliance. Next to him is Dr. Kathleen Hicks, former Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, currently with CSIS. Next to her is Barbara Barrett, who just a couple weeks ago in October became the 25th Secretary of the Air Force. And finally, Representative Mike Rogers, member of the House Strategic Force Subcommittee, and I think it's safe to say one of the most known proponents of a Space Force and Space Corps. So thank you all for joining me. We had planned to open with kind of a general question, go down the line, but I think the first thing that everyone's going to want to know is we know there's an NDAA agreement somewhat in place. Representative Rogers, so, yeah? What do we got?
Yeah, we have been informed yesterday that the NDAA does have a final agreement. We worked out the peripheral issues. Space Force was not one of those. It's been agreed upon for a couple of months as far as the structure. And the conferees will be signing the conference report out Monday afternoon and introducing the bill Monday night and then voting on it on Wednesday. So the hay's not in the barn yet, but it's real close to the barn door.
So say this is a good thing for you? You're happy?
I've been glowing for the last day. So I'm very happy.
All right, well, with that out of the way, and we'll politely not push any further unless you feel the need to share. No, okay. We'll go back to our original plan, which is just kind of to start, generally speaking. Given where America's space is today, we're given the capabilities that exist now, the capabilities that we're starting to invest in, the capabilities that some of our adversary nations are in. Big picture question, how do you feel about America's position vis-a-vis space right now? Do you feel we're doing well? Do we need to improve in certain areas? What's your biggest concerns? And maybe we'll just start with Representative Rogers and go down the line.
Well, we have allowed China and Russia to become our peers, not our near peers. And that's unacceptable. And both countries are putting a larger percentage of their defense dollars into space than we are. And they're moving at a faster clip. So unless we start going a lot faster and functioning a lot more efficiently, they could surpass our capabilities in the foreseeable future. That was the driving concern for the Armed Services Committee as we began looking for solutions to how we deal with space differently. But I feel good that we have accepted over the last 3 to 4 years that we had to be moving in a more rapid clip and being more aggressive, and we've been taking it very seriously, and we've been doing some things short of the Space Force to catch up to the pace we want to be on and maintain our dominance in space and regain a significant amount of dominance in the not too distant future. So I feel good, but I'll feel a lot better in about 3 or 4 years.
Ma'am?
America's the best there is in space. Yet, as we watch the trajectory of potential enemies, we see that the relationship is changing. And America is also the biggest user of space. Our way of life is more dependent upon space than any other nation's. And our capability in space was predominantly built at a time when we thought that space was a benign environment. Yet, since then, in 2007, the Chinese demonstrated their ability to take satellites, their own satellite in that case, out of the skies. So we know we are now vulnerable. So the assets upon which we depend are now vulnerable. America has more to lose if there is malicious behavior in space. So while we are ahead, we have more to lose. It is important for America to get on the case of space, and we've got to be able to deter derogatory action in space And if deterrence doesn't work, we need to be prepared to be something other than a victim with our space assets. So where we are is ahead, but that lead is shrinking, and our vulnerability and our dependence is greater than anyone else. It's time for us to move forward with the Space Force.
Dr. Hicks?
Yeah, I agree with the Secretary. You know, Americans always do best, and it's probably human nature when a challenge is right in front of us. So we've known space is a domain of great significance for the warfighter for a long time. Even in the 2001 QDR, most of which was written pre-9/11, there was an emphasis around space. And here we are these many years later having very much the same types of conversation. But the good news, I think, if you will, is that the threat is more clear. Part of that is because we're talking about it more, and I would encourage us to keep doing that. And thusly, I am going to show you the CSIS Todd Harrison great product of space threat assessment, completely unclassified information to help communicate to the American people, which we need to be doing, what these challenges are that we're talking about in space. But I agree with the Secretary. I think it's a huge challenge set because it's ours to lose, if you will. And we've been a bit negligent, to say the least. Now we need to get beyond the organizational issues into the real capabilities development and doctrine and the multilateral aspects that are necessary for us to advance in space.
That's good branding. Good job. Tori, you want to go ahead?
I do not have a report with me. Would
Do you have a
like
rocket
to
ship
show yours
you show
again?
us, or?
Yeah, so I absolutely agree with my colleagues. This is a tremendously important moment in time. There has not been a new warfighting domain in literally over 100 years. And the significance of space to us cannot be overstated. Our economic system, our way of life, our unrivaled power of our military to keep the peace is entirely dependent on space. Our adversaries know that, and they have brought an asymmetric threat to us in space. But it is also fundamentally different than any other warfighting domain we have contended with in the past. The vastness of space is unimaginable. It is both a challenge and an opportunity. When we think about an air domain like Syria, Earth orbit is 100 million Syrias in volume. And cislunar space is 12 billion. And it is governed by a set of physics that are not important to us on the surface of the Earth. So yeah, this is a heck of a challenge. But our system is superior in its ability to bring innovation and capability like no other in the world. American openness will always defeat an authoritarian regime, and we will prevail, but we got to get on it.
So there's two things that were mentioned up here which I thought kind of tie in together. One is the idea of deterrence, and one is the question of classification. And in the past, there's been the idea of, okay, if we classify things too much, maybe you can't explain to the American public, to potential adversaries, frankly, what's going on, what we can do. Is this a concern as we're starting these conversations?
Yeah, the Secretary and I had breakfast earlier this week on this topic, and my request to her was just that, to declassify a lot of the information that we have on space because it is overwhelmingly classified. And that's one of the reasons why, when this proposal was first passed out of the House 2 years ago, the late night comics, had a ball with it. And then President Trump got behind. They still did, because they don't understand. We're not talking about Star Trek kind of things. We're talking about our satellites, very important assets. And so the public doesn't know. It makes it harder for the members of Congress, who we have to, as members of the Armed Services Committee and the appropriators, the defense appropriators, we get it. But we have to have our other colleagues in the Congress to be supportive of us making the changes we need and putting the resources we need into this. It's not going to happen until they understand the threat and the dependence that we have. And I don't think that can happen until we see significant declassification of what we're doing in space and what China and Russia are doing, and how space is in their daily lives. They don't know when they go to the gas pump, put their debit card in there to get gas, that they're using a satellite. There's a whole host of things they don't realize about their daily lives that depend on satellites. So I think once that's exposed to them, and they see what we're doing in space and what China and Russia are doing in space, they will be very supportive of this initiative, and they'll understand it, and it will make it easier for those of us in Congress to be able to get the resources that she needs to be successful in her job.
You want to touch on that?
I agree completely. I would just add that the lack of an understanding really does hurt us in doing things that we need to do in space. The inability for people to recognize that the public doesn't recognize, and therefore there isn't a constituency for space, even though almost everyone uses space before their first cup of coffee in the morning. Everything, communication, navigation, information, everything is dependent upon space, but people don't recognize that. Another thing people haven't recognized, I bet fewer than 10% of the American public recognize that since 2011, the only way American astronauts can get to our $110 billion investment 225 miles up at the International Space Station, the only way we can get there is by buying a seat from the Russians. And our space shuttle has been grounded since 2011. And even before that, we were getting to the space station partly by using seats bought by us from the Russians. We are dependent upon others for much of our space access, and that's just not the position that America should be in or would want to be in. So we need to make some changes, and it's really for a lack of understanding. And I agree that declassifying some of what is currently held in secure vaults would be a good idea. You can do it wrongly. We need to be careful about what we declassify, but there is much more classified than what needs to be.
When do you think we might start to see some of these programs be declassified?
When would we declassify them? From my perspective, we can save the obligation to make some investments if we do declassify, so the sooner the better, from my perspective.
Interesting. Kath, maybe just to follow up on that, I mean, are there any specific capabilities that you think are lacking in the space systems right now that perhaps, there may be systems that exist that could perhaps duplicate them, avoid just having to go out and buy more systems, put new things in orbit?
I think it would be hard for me to answer that in an unclassified way for the
Fair
reason
enough.
we just talked
Fair
about.
enough.
So I'll ask a question you didn't. I'll answer a question you didn't ask, which is I just wanted to pull the thread a little further to the ability to work with the commercial sector and, of course, our allies and partners. The classification issues really get in the way for both of those constituencies who are incredibly important for us to advance and we have these great advantages on innovation because of our commercial sector, because of our ability to work with other countries and commercial sectors in other countries. But to get that leverage, we're going to have to take a little more risk, I think, on the classification side.
Tori, would that help you out from the industry side, having this classification issue solved?
It certainly would, but not just in a technology sense as we discussed, because we have the ability to work in that environment. I agree with Congressman Rogers that the American public needs to understand that this is a priority. Today, the average American looks at China as a trading partner, not as a predatory economic activity on our shores, acquiring our intellectual property, harming American jobs and American business interests, raising capital through those activities so that we are paying for their own military expansion to threaten our assets in space, which, as the Secretary has pointed out, touches all our lives every single day. And it is 100 or so completely fragile and utterly unprotected assets. We need to get on this problem right now and understand exactly the magnitude of it, and that we cannot afford to have Chinese investment in equity ownership in technology companies in the U.S. where they acquire our intellectual property and where they are able to maintain an advantage in application that they have today.
From an industrial standpoint, is there enough of a, for lack of a better term, American or trusted supplier base to do the things that we're thinking about with a Space Comm, Space Force, growing space assets? I mean, is the base there, or does there need to be more of a push from government, from other industry folks to grow that capability? Tori, maybe you want to start on that one.
Sure, I'll jump in. I'll say absolutely we have what we need to start this journey, but the country, when facing a challenge of this nature, will benefit from a broader industrial base. And so, for example, the Air Force is currently running a major competition to expand launch and make sure that we have 2 American providers to do that. I hope to be one of them. I am very supportive of that competition. It's healthy for the government, it is healthy for industry, and it is good for the country. And while your ears aren't plugged, I'll say the Air Force is doing a great job in organizing that acquisition. And ULA and somebody else will be here to support you.
Well,
Of course, while that is under consideration, we
Yes.
won't have an ex parte communication on the topic, but it is really important for us to have an industrial base that can accomplish the missions that we need to accomplish and have the discipline of competition in that process. And so it's important for us to have a solid, reliable, fair, predictable process.
what about international partners? Because we've heard a couple of times here that one of the great advantages America has over a competitor like China is our allies and partners and the ability to bring that to bear. Given that a lot of these countries didn't have space capabilities until recently, but now there's more of a commercial space boom, some countries are getting this capability. Do you see a greater role going forward for international partnerships in space? And is there anything that maybe Congress has to do to give authorities to allow other countries that maybe aren't, the Five Eyes to work with us in space?
Well, we have, obviously we need to have partnerships with our allies in space. But we have already been doing some work. There's a company called Rocket Lab in New Zealand that we've been working with both through the government and in commercial enterprises, doing some really creative, innovative things on bringing the cost of launch down and the ability to get launches up quickly. And and these are smaller rockets. But one of the things General Hyten talks about, and he's absolutely right, is we need to get away from, as he calls them, the big juicy targets. There's huge satellites that have enormous capability. But again, once it's taken out, we've lost our capability. He wants to see a lot of smaller sats out there. They have a shorter life, don't do as many things, but they have resilience. So a launch service like the one in Rocket Lab in New Zealand would help us with that, and that's an international company. But there are others too. There's nothing but good to come from working with our allies as we go into this new endeavor, in my view.
Something like launch is a good example. What about something where it was a satellite designed by an ally or a partner, which could maybe bridge a gap with capability of the U.S., then the U.S. doesn't have to launch it? Is that something that's being considered that you could see happening the next couple of years?
Of course. I can't imagine why it wouldn't, unless it was China.
So I'd add to what the congressman says in terms of America has always been stronger in concert with her allies. And this will be no different than any other challenge we have faced. In the space industry, we are also dealing with a small industry, especially in launch. It's a very narrow highway to space. And the United States happens to be the only country with an actual commercial marketplace for lift. All other nations with lift capability have those as national captive assets. And so we must also manage our industry to have a healthy industry. And I'll add a little bit to the disaggregation story as well, because it is important and it's essential. One of the concerns I've had over time is that we are not tempted by trying to find the magic point solution that will solve this problem for us. There is no single thing. Disaggregation is a vital and essential tool in our toolbox. It has a narrow application. And the idea behind it is you could take a mission and place it into a distributed network such that it is robust to damage of losing a satellite or two, and if you do it right, perhaps self-healing, is a great strategy, especially in LEO, which is nearly indefensible because of the short time for a threat to engage and destroy a satellite. It works for communications, it works for PNT, it might work for certain types of tracking. There are many other missions for which it will not work because the physics don't allow it. And so we need to have that as well as the other tools that will solve the complete problem.
It actually raises a question. So disaggregation in the last couple of years, the multiple satellites, small systems, getting away from the big targets, as you said, has kind of been talked about in a way as its own defensive system, right? If we disaggregate, we'll be able to defend. That cures a lot of our problems. How much does the U.S. need to be investing, U.S. and its allies, but U.S., in actual defensive capabilities for space assets that can allow them to actually defend themselves, not just by having many of them, but in real time?
In recent years, the Air Force has really gotten after that because of the threats. And I can't go into detail, but because we saw how aggressive China in particular has been, we didn't have a choice. And the Air Force has done a good job getting after that. And we're going to have to stay vigilant in that part of what we do. That's not going to change, in my view.
Madam Secretary?
Look, as we sit here under the wing of Air Force One from the Reagan administration, I think about a study that was done about the gathering storm back in the mid-1980s. And in that study, a concluding comment was that if a foreign enemy had done to us what we have done to ourselves, we would consider it an act of war. In many ways, that's happening to us today, not just in the education realm, but also in technology. Technology doesn't wait. Technology is moving on. If America's involved in it, we can be winners. If we stand on the sidelines in technology, and that includes space, then we will not be players in the great economic and military future of our globe. When we have continuing resolutions that tell us to sit on the sideline for a quarter and not make investments, we are defaulting on technology. Technology is moving on, and we're saying that we are going to hold back for a quarter of our year while others are making investments. America cannot retain the lead if we go through a process where technology is stifled. And of course, I'm a little biased, I confess. I think that the United States Air Force is the most dependent upon technology. And I believe within the Air Force that space is the especially dependent element that is upon technology, that relies upon technology more than any other. So this very domain that is so important to our way of life, to everything we do, to our water, our power, our ATMs, our gas pumps, everything we do is dependent upon space, and we are defaulting on that as we do not budget for, and what happens with the continuing resolution is you can keep doing things you were doing, but you can't do anything new. What's new? That's technology. So the continuing resolution is absolutely handing off technology leadership to those in other settings. So that's an important element to me on investment.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to the technology conversation. There's obviously lots more that needs to be happening right now in the space arena, and this is largely, I'm thinking, in terms of Space Command. And that's really making sure that we're not caught where we are on cyber, where we're trying to chase where the norms ought to be, what are our rules of the road, what should the doctrine be, what does escalation mean. We actually have an opportunity, I think, to do better in space than we have in cyber if we can start getting Space Command and the leadership in OSD focused on these big questions that help us to set the playing field. We're not looking to have a war in space. No one on this stage is looking to have a war in space. So the question is, how do we defend ourselves effectively? How do we stay at the cutting edge and create a strong deterrent from anyone else seeking to pursue tactics or warfare in space? And that's going to take a lot of time and investment in and of itself beyond the technology focus that we're all talking about here today.
So, we talked a little about explaining what a Space Force is to the American public. And one question that, when I talk to my family about this, and they all have seen the same jokes and comments, and they go, okay, so what's the point of a Space Force? Are we fighting Martians? And I say, well, no, we're fighting guys from the moon. That's separate. But the one question that I think is out there, and it might be good just to get folks to weigh in on it, is the question of essentially mission. Is this a mission to defend assets? Should the focus be defending assets in space, ensuring if we do want to travel to the moon or to Mars, in a civil mission, that we have a clear path to do that? Or should the missions really be more focused on enabling warfighters terrestrially? Or does the answer have to be both because that's just where we're at?
It's absolutely both.
Yeah.
I mean, we have to be able to defend what we have there that we count on. We have to replace our defenseless or the things that are there that that require external defense. So we need to put things in space that can themselves be defended. We need to then be able to use space as an enabler for our war fighters in other domains. So we need to be able to have free access to space for ourselves and others, benevolent others, and we need to be able to use space as a provider of capability for our warfighters. And to do all of that, we need talent that is trained and capable of producing the assets that we would use for that capability.
I would add to that and say it is absolutely both. Ultimately, our adversaries are interested in space because they have ambitions here on Earth, and they cannot contemplate contending with our conventional forces because of their tremendous effectiveness in arenas where they seek to intimidate our allies. For example, space is an opportunity for them to level that playing field. What is new is that they are prepared now to take that warfare to space, and we will have to actually and actively defend our assets in orbit. But I'll also look a little bit further ahead. There will be expanded commerce in space. And as we look into the future decades, and the other side of NASA's Artemis program, there will be substantial commercial activities in cislunar space. And we will also be asked with our capable military to ensure the freedom of that commerce and the freedom of transit and transportation through space.
One of the issues with standing up space assets, as we're talking about expanding them in the future, is the kind of, for lack of a better term, balkanized acquisition process that involves space right now. A lot of different people have a lot of different hands on a lot of different things, and they all say they're talking to each other, but we all know how bureaucracy really works. Space Development Agency is one that was, with your predecessor, Madam Secretary, was not a big fan of the Space Development Agencies. Others have said it's a good system to go forward. On the SDA, do you think the process they're following right now is the correct one? And looking forward, do you think there really has to be a centralized single acquisition entity for space? Maybe Congressman, if you want to start with that.
Yeah, I do. And we're doing the right stuff. We set up U.S. Space Command first, Space Force second, SDA will come down the road. And I think it should be that way. The thing that started my subcommittee really down this road initially was companies in Tory's business and others coming to us and talking about how difficult the procurement acquisition process was in the Air Force. And it's not unique to the Air Force. All the services have the same problem. And so one of my chief focuses in this initial year or two of the Space Force is to make sure bureaucratic acquisition creep doesn't go into this new organization. And I think keeping it centralized in SDA is going to help us keep that from happening. But this has to be a lean and agile acquisition system because of what you heard earlier. This is a very rapid moving technology. That's another reason why General Hyten wants to get away from the big, exquisite satellites. It's because the technology is changing so fast that when COCOMs come to General Goldfein or to anybody that has to make the final decisions and says, I need this satellite, if it's a big exquisite, it's 10 or 12 years before it gets up there. The world has changed, so we have got to keep it lean and agile, and that's going to be the thing I'm more focused on than anything in the coming years in our oversight role is to make sure it does not get cluttered up with a lot of processes that are unnecessary.
Secretary Barrett, thoughts on the acquisition system?
I couldn't agree more. There are ways to do this badly. One would be to create a big bureaucracy. What we need is not bureaucracy. What we need is capability. So we need assets in space, not a vast bureaucracy. And we don't need duplicate acquisitions programs. We need to have a unified but efficient, agile acquisition system that proceeds with alacrity. It's been fun to see some of the things that are happening now in acquisitions for space. I attended one of the first things I did as secretary was to go to a space pitch day working with the Silicon Valley companies and watching as they came in with innovations that they wanted to pitch to the Air Force as ways that we could do space resources, use space resources better. General Thompson came up from the SMC and Dr. Will Roper came in from Washington, and people came with a great enthusiasm, and folks walked out of there with contracts, quite in contrast with the usual way an acquisition would work. We need to inspire young people, and one of the great things is to see the resumes that are coming in because people want to be associated with the Space Force. It's a renewed excitement. It's maybe our Sputnik Revisited, where we actually have people very excited about studying, learning about technologies and physics, and we need to be moving quickly in acquisitions in order to accommodate that. Duplicate systems are not what we need. We need efficient, positive, single systems to get that done.
Dr. Hicks, you're at OSD, so you know a thing or two about bureaucracy. I mean, do you have any thoughts on way forward?
Yeah. Well, I think I don't have a specific view on how to break down the responsibilities. We don't have, Space Force set up yet, let alone Space Development Agency, to understand exactly how these would work out. So I leave that there. I will say, I think the key, which has been hit on by several of us here, is let's get past the design orientation of the bureaucracy and let's get on to what is that mission set that we want these different organizations to be able to hone and contribute to. We're not looking to add more organizations, we're looking to add value, which goes beyond capability. Capability is very important, but it also goes on to how we think about, do we have the culture and the people, the processes to help us advance in this domain in a way that advantages the United States relative to those threats, both terrestrially and in space.
So, if I could add to something the Secretary said that I thought was actually pretty exciting. The reason we will prevail and the power of our open society is our ability to innovate. And the Secretary talked about something that Dr. Roper had done out in the Silicon Valley to bring new players and new ideas into this arena. Established industry has a role to play here as well. One of the things we do in our company is we go out and we look for new companies who are in the space arena or in the technology arena that applies, that we get to know and we think might have a future. And we cultivate a relationship and we help them along and we assist them with business plans and we introduce them to the Air Force and to people like that, and every now and again they turn into a customer for a lift. So it's all very symbiotic. But that's something I think we should encourage more in the larger, more established companies to help mentor and bring those people along. The Air Force should not have to do all the heavy lifting on themselves.
Something that's popped in my mind, so Secretary Barrett, I'm going to just ask you, we still don't actually know where Space Command is going to be based. That's a decision that's being worked on. Do you have any update for when we might have an answer on that?
Bless your heart.
Yes, again, I have no, I don't have an update for you except to say that the process will be one that is being designed and will be worked through with it keeping in mind the idea that once we establish a site, we need it to be defensible and not have it then be the subject to legal challenge that would delay the startup. We need a process that's going to have a firm and final answer when it is decided. And it may be that it's going to take a little more time to get that done so that it's done right and reliably for a long-term future.
So speaking of legal challenges, I'm not going to ask you to comment on the situation with the launch contract, because I know that is under protest. What I am curious about is, are you at all concerned that the protest could delay the awarding of this contract and push it back a couple years? I know, Tori, you've talked in the past being very concerned that a delay is going to basically have follow-on effects.
There are warfighting needs right now that are to be addressed by this acquisition. These are not the same missions we've been flying for the last 10 years. They are more difficult missions with heavier payloads and higher energy orbits. We need to support the warfighter and get on with this.
We play by the rules. So we will go through the acquisitions process in accordance with the rules. It could be that America would benefit if we had some compressed timeframes for some of the rules, because technology doesn't wait. And the longer we go through decision-making and protest, we need to have a process by which there is decision-making and protest. But the time that's sunk into that now seems to be excessive.
Fair enough.
Congressman.
I'm also curious, Secretary, I'm sorry to put you on the spot here a little bit again, but there were some comments made over the weekend at the RAND event, the AA event that happened yesterday, by Air Force General who said, we think we have, I believe it was, quote, a dollar amount for standing up a Space Force, have a dollar amount in mind. There was a memo that you wrote to Secretary Esper talking about resources that could be ready to go if once the Space Force is pushed through. How confident are you in those estimates that it could be, several $1 billion? You could perhaps stand up in 30 days with 200 individuals as a headquarters staff if, Space Force is passed, the NDA passes, gets authorized, everything goes forward.
But we're going to look and see what the NDA actually includes. And then there is a war room that has been meeting and putting together plans and organizing what will happen, how do we roll this out. It will be dependent upon what the resources are, what we can do, but we're putting together designs and plans for the best way to do it with what resources we're given. And the whole team is very much devoted to the idea of this is a really serious business. We've got to get this done. We're going to do it with the best alacrity that we can incorporate into it, and we've got top talent putting it together. So a war room is not usually you designing a bureaucratic or a new structure, but that's what's happening right now.
Yeah, and I don't want the Secretary to feel constrained to arbitrary budget number that we think it's going to cost. We want her to create the best Space Force that the world is ever going to see. And she needs to tell us how much money she needs to do that. And it's our problem to make sure she gets the resources she needs. But we've been talking relatively modest numbers for this initial year or so, and I think that those were realistic numbers they gave us. But as we go further down the road, I don't want us to give her a number and say make it fit. I want her to tell us this is the number I need to make it work.
Thank you, Congressman.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
See, Congress and the Pentagon can get along.
Yeah.
Great. We love seeing it. Representative Rogers, actually, question for you. There was a GA report that you used to wave around a couple of times. Hearings about, there were, I believe, 60 entities in the U.S. government that all kind of dealt with national security space. While we've been getting to the point of standing up a Space Force, there's been efforts to kind of constrict that a little bit, organize it. Has that improved over the last couple of years?
Not at all. And that's why this has to be done. It's got to be a separate organization with a separate culture, separate budget, separate acquisition and procurement system from scratch. And it's my hope that when the Space Force is successful at this leaner, more agile system, that will be a model for the other services to then rip up what they've got and take all those bureaucracies out. And anybody that's dealt with them knows, and this is not unique to the Air Force, it's in all the services. You have an no pun intended, an army of committees that all have a say-so in a decision. Nobody owns decision authority. And that's one of the reasons why it takes so long to get things done. So hopefully by starting from scratch with the Space Force, demonstrating that it can be done leanly, that you can empower officers to make decisions without having to go through a committee process, we can then replicate that in the other services.
So essentially, you think there's maybe a roadmap, for lack of a better term?
Absolutely.
Interesting. Mr. You look like you want to jump in on that.
Attention spans being what they are, we're going to want to get this as close to right as we can from the beginning. And then there will be fine-tuning that we'll need to do on implementation over time, but we want to get it as close to right as possible from the beginning. And we want it to be sort of the textbook example of how to set up a new technologically based entity.
How do you keep the new entity from just ballooning in terms of personnel and people? I mean, we've certainly seen that happens in the past. And this is going to be the first time the Air Force is essentially, Secretary of the Air Force has had a second military branch under control. So it's the Marines are a model, but it's a different situation.
It's a completely different situation. The Marines are very much a manpower-based service,
Right.
but we can learn some things from how the Marines have done it, and there are a lot of other things that we'll be doing quite differently because this will be a technologically based, talent-driven, technologically based entity. And we'll get a lot of help and we'll get a lot of input on how to do it, but we're putting the A-team on it and we're working to build the very best system. And there'll be a lot of contested elements as we go through the process. But I think what you can rely upon is that there are people looking at this that are doing it with a lot of thought and a lot of attention to building the capabilities, building the resources so that we are a safer and technologically space-enabled environment.
It might, I'm sorry. It might shock you to hear this, but in private industry, we have bureaucracies that grow up as well. And so even once it's off on the right foot, it is a constant and never-ending battle.
Absolutely.
Dr. Hicks?
I was just going to add, if we're at a point now, which I believe we are, where the nation's decided it's going to have a Space Force. Congress has decided, the President's decided it. We have to get the pen across the bottom line, but that seems to be where we are. I think the time is right. This absolutely has to happen in an efficient way, but to take Representative Rogers' point, in an effective way. And I think that's where the focus ought to be between the executive and the congressional branch. But the big cost issues for space are the capability investments. That's where we ought to be focusing our attention. We're so apt, I think, to try to follow the trail of the bureaucracies, the costs of the particulars. That's important, don't get me wrong. The real investment challenge for the United States is actually paying for the kinds of capabilities and the quality of space capabilities we think we need. And I think we ought to start turning our attention to that issue set, which I'll say once again, that's going to require, which I think is the purpose of both Space Command and Space Force, that's going to require real dedicated attention to what the challenges are, what our mission statement is, how do we think about plans with regard to space, what are those capabilities, defense, offense, that we need, and how do we think about deterrence and escalation dynamics? And that'll drive the cost.
You've hit that point a couple of times in the comments up here that we need to be keeping the focus in the right area. How do we do that?
I think it's all in the culture, and I very much agree, as close as you can get it to right from the beginning in terms of how you set these institutions up, and institutions plural is what we're talking about, because many of the things I'm talking about are not specifically the role of the Space Force. They're Space Command issues, and they're issues for the chairman, and they're issues ultimately for the Secretary of Defense and for the President. So that's a whole set of conversations that needs to happen quickly, thoroughly, and it starts with integrating space conversations into everything we do. Now, I am sure much of that is already happening inside the Department of Defense. So this is about getting that culture really driven through both the command and, because there are now seats at the table, in the command and then through Space Force, so that we can have a much more informed conversation.
There is no substitute for leadership. And fortunately, the country has been gifted with the right people at this moment in time.
I want to talk about threats, because we actually haven't necessarily identified the threats that are a concern going forward, aside from just generally speaking about China, which I think is a theme of this whole conference, but a little bit nebulous. What's the biggest threats that you're concerned about in space? What's the biggest risk that you see?
There are enormous things they can do to us, but this will give you a single example of why militarily this is important to us. We have a constellation of satellites over the planet that their primary role is to watch for heat signatures. Now, the reason we're interested in heat signatures, if you've seen one of Tory's rockets go up, it creates a big plume and a lot of heat. Well, generally, what we're worried about is somebody shooting one of those rockets at us. So we have these satellites out there, let's say looking at somebody like North Korea. And when it sees that heat plume, we know to turn all of our radar systems to that heat plume so we can start tracking whatever that rocket is. And we know within literally a minute, less than a minute, where it's going. And now, if you take an ICBM coming from North Korea to, let's say, California, 18 to 24 minutes for it to get there. Ballistic missiles just do this. They go through the atmosphere out into space, come back down. Now, when they're coming down, they're coming too fast. You got to kill it up here in the mid-course area. Ideally, we'd like to kill it in the boost phase, but at least in the mid-course. Think about it, 18 minutes. Now, if our adversaries were able to blind one of that particular satellite that's watching for that heat signature just for 10 minutes, and let's say somebody like China would like to see North Korea have a successful attack on us, and they use one of their satellites to blind ours for just 10 minutes. If you know North Korea's rockets, they keep them on trucks. They pull them out of either a cave or some building, erect it, and launch. So if they could blind us for 10 minutes, they could launch that satellite, and we didn't know about it for the first 5 minutes, it would be very, very difficult for us to be able to get an interceptor up there and take it out. That is a very real vulnerability that we cannot allow to happen. And the truth is, China and Russia both have that capability now to do that to one of our satellites. So, and that's unacceptable. They also have to understand that if you ever do try to attack one of our satellites, whether it's an attack like I described or hit it, that the consequences would be overwhelming. And we don't have that capability right now. We need to make sure we get it soon.
So unfortunately, I've been an awful moderator and did not see where the clock was. And unfortunately, we are now out of time. So that's my fault. Apologize if folks can't get some questions in. But thanks to all our panelists for this great conversation. I think we all got a little caught up in it, which is fantastic. Please join me thanking them.
Thank you.
And thank you all for your time.